Hello everyone and welcome to day 3 of Hello Coding. In this day, we're going to learn how to build your first game with JavaScript. JavaScript is one of the most popular languages of the year in terms of demand and hireability, so it is a great language to learn, especially for beginners. We're going to learn JavaScript the fun way by building a rock, paper, scissors game. Now, we are still using jessitor.com, which contains tabs for HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. You can follow along with any code editor you like. If you're using an online code editor, then all of your JavaScript goes into the JavaScript tag. If you are using an offline code editor, like a text editor or Visual Studio or Atom, then all of your code for your JavaScript should go into the body tag and inside of a script tag. So inside of your HTML body tag, at the bottom of the body tag, you will need to add this script tag if you're using an offline code editor. Then you can either write your code into this script tag, or you could also make an external JavaScript file, call it something like index.js, and then write all of your code in that file. And then inside of your HTML, all you have to do is make this reference at the bottom of your body tag to index.js. Just make sure it's inside of the same folder if you're using this relative path. Then the HTML will be able to access your index.js file. If you don't want to put it directly into two script tags, if you don't want to put it directly in between here, then you can put it into an external file if you wish. The easiest way to follow along is just to use an online code editor where you can just write all of your JavaScript into this JavaScript tab, and then whenever you download the file, the code editor will automatically put it into the script tag for you, so you won't have to make your own external file. Otherwise, using JavaScript with HTML and CSS is straightforward. You'll get the hang of it very quickly, especially if you're using an online code editor to just write in your JavaScript and then you can preview it instantly in the browser and in the console. Let's begin building our project in the next lecture. Hello everyone and welcome back to day 3 of Hello Coding. Today we're going to learn about JavaScript, which is the programming language that allows you to write the functionality of a website. HTML created the skeleton of the website. It created the elements. CSS applied styling and positioning to the elements. And now we're on to JavaScript, which handles the functionality of the website. JavaScript handles everything from handling user interaction to creating animations to getting user input and forms and much, much more. Let's begin with our quick dive into JavaScript. We're going to build a game together, and the first step of building the game is going to be to enable us to grab user input. What I'm going to do in my HTML is write 3 buttons, and then JavaScript is going to be able to handle whenever the user clicks on the buttons. So in HTML, let's make a button element, and inside here we can put in the text that we want to appear. So in my case, I'm going to use an emoji of a fist, which represents the rock, part of our rock, paper, scissors game. And here in our browser, we can see we have a button that has appeared right there. Let's put in 3 buttons in total to represent rock, paper, and scissors. The HTML creates the buttons on our page. You can see here. But how do we actually perform some action when the user clicks on the button? Well, the actions, any kind of change that we want to happen, we do that with JavaScript. All right, so here are our 3 buttons. Inside of JavaScript, I can first grab a reference to those buttons. For that, I'm going to make what's known as a variable called buttons, and this variable is going to store all of our buttons. We make a variable with the keyword let. You can also use the keyword var to make a variable. You can use either of these 2 keywords, let or var. A variable is a container for data. So it's like we're having a box that we can refer to again and again. So we can use buttons because it will store our 3 buttons. If you use var to declare the variable, then that means that this variable buttons, it can be accessed outside of its scope. So it can be accessed anywhere. But if you use let, it limits the scope in which you can access the buttons. It means the buttons can only be accessed in the scope where you declare them. Now, how do we grab the buttons? Well, what we can do is apply a class to each button tag, and then we can use JavaScript to select all of the buttons that have that class. So I'm going to give each button the class of player hand. All right, so each button will have the same class because, as you'll recall, from days 1 and 2 of Hello Coding, a class can be shared between multiple elements. Then in JavaScript, we can use document.query select selector all. Document refers to the website, to the document object model, which is the HTML page. Query selector all is a function. A function means it will perform some action. And query selector all is a pre-made function that we can use, and it allows us to select all of a certain element that match a condition. In our case, the condition is that we're looking for the class of player hand. So here we're passing in the parameter .player hand as a string because it's in quotation marks. And this is going to be passed to this query selector all function. And it's going to find all of the HTML elements that have the class player hand. And it will store all of those in the buttons variable. Then here, notice I've closed off the line with a semicolon. Semicolons are not required in JavaScript. They are required in some languages like C# or Java. And in other languages like Python, a semicolon is never used. But in JavaScript, a semicolon is optional. I recommend including the semicolon because it helps you see where a line ends. A semicolon is like a period at the end of a sentence. It tells the compiler, which is what compiles the code and renders it in the browser. It tells the compiler that the line is ended. Great, so just like that, we have our buttons stored in this variable called buttons. If you don't believe me, then try this out. Call console.log buttons. Console refers to the view console, which is the console that we can use as developers to help with debugging our website. So here, if you go to your browser, you can see the console. And console, if you call console.log, it means you want to log or print something to the console. And in our case, we are logging out the buttons variable. So we're going to see what is the buttons variable. And the buttons variable is this node list right here. If you click on it, you can see The buttons variable is a node list that contains 3 elements, 0, 1, and 2. And each element is an HTML button element. You can see here. The length is 3 because there are 3 buttons. And we can even see the different values and items contained. So this proves that we have been able to store all 3 buttons in a variable because we have node list printed out here. I can log something else too. I can call console.log and I can log out a string like hello, just make sure it's in quotation marks. And then look at that. Now I see hello in my console. If you ever come across some bug, aside from searching it on the web to find a solution to your error, you can also call console.log to see perhaps if you accidentally made a mistake of saving something. So perhaps you thought you saved buttons, but buttons was actually null. If you try to log out something like buttons, but you get null instead of node list, it means you were not able to successfully save the 3 buttons in this variable and something went wrong. Likely you have a typo. All right, so now we have our 3 buttons stored. What we can do next is work on handling user interaction. So now that we have the button stored, we can add a listener for what we want to happen when the button is clicked. We'll work on that in the next lecture. Hello everyone and welcome back to Hello Coding. In the previous lecture, you learned how to create 3 buttons on the page and also how to select all of those buttons with JavaScript. You also learned how to use the console to log out messages. In this lecture, we're going to learn how we can listen for the press of a button, because currently when I press on one of these buttons, nothing happens, but I can change that. Let's jump into our JavaScript tab where we are going to start adding a listener to each button. For that, what we can do is call buttons.forEach. For each refers to a for each loop. This means we're going to perform one action for each button in our buttons array here. Our buttons node list, to be specific. So we have a list of buttons and we're going to loop over each of them and perform some action. What do we want to do for each button? Well, we want to add an event listener to listen for the click of the button. To open up this for each loop, I have to first make some local variable here called button. This refers to each button that we're looping through. Then we use curly brackets to open up what we want to happen for each button. So here we have this equal sign and greater than sign, and that is to specify that the code after it in this curly bracket, that's what we want to happen for each button in our buttons node list. So for each button, I'm going to call the button and use the function known as addEventListener. A function is the same thing as a method, and this here is another pre-made function, just like query selector all. addEventListener is a pre-made function that we can use, and it's going to attach a listener to each button. A listener means we're listening for some event. There are lots of events that happen on the browser. There's the click of a button, there's scrolling, there is zooming in even, there's changing the browser size, there is hitting enter, there's typing, there's hovering. There are so many events that could potentially happen on the web page. And we can listen for any type of event that we want. For example, in our case, we want to add an event listener for whenever the user clicks on the button. So for that, we are going to pass in here the argument click as a string, meaning it's in double quotations. That's because addEventListener, it expects a string as an argument. It is looking for a click event. So that means we are going to listen for whenever the button is clicked, and we can perform some action. To specify the action that you want performed, you use a comma, and then you put in what you want to happen. In my case, I want to start a round. So I'm going to use start round, which is going to be a function that I will have to make. Because currently, start round doesn't exist, but start round is going to be a function that I'm going to make, and I'm going to use the keyword function to open a new function. It has to have the exact same name, start round, with this exact same capitalization and spelling. Then I use 2 parentheses to open up the function, and then curly brackets to specify the function body. So the keyword function followed by the function name and these 2 parentheses, this is the function header. And then anything in the curly brackets, that is the function body. So that is the task that the function performs. Functions are extremely commonly used in almost all programming languages because they perform tasks. You can separate tasks into functions, such as starting a round. So this means every time the button is clicked, we are going to call the start round function to perform some action. All right, so then here we can perform some action inside of start round, such as we could call console.log and we could say round will begin. This is just a test for now. This means whenever we click any button, we should log a line to our console that says round will begin. Let's test that out by going to our browser and opening the console and clicking on a button. Look at that. Did you see? Round will begin just appeared. If I click again another button, round will begin appears again. And then I can click another button and so forth. Every time I click a button, round will begin gets logged into my console. That is exactly what I wanted to happen. If you ever want to refresh and clear the console, just hit the big run button in the top right-hand corner. Then you can start clicking buttons all over again, and the console will be cleared from the beginning. All right, so this means we were successfully able to add an event listener to our button. We're specifically listening only for the click of a button. So we're not listening for the hover or the release or the long hold. We're only listening for one click of a button, and every time one of our buttons is clicked, we will call this function start round. Join me in the next lecture where we're going to set what we want to happen when a round does occur. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Hello Coding. In the previous lecture, you learned how to handle presses of a button via JavaScript. In this lecture, we're going to learn how we can use JavaScript to affect the HTML. So we're going to listen for when the player and when the computer make a hand play, and we will show that hand play on the HTML. So we're going to learn how we can use JavaScript to affect HTML. To get started, we need some more HTML. We need, inside of our HTML, some code that shows the player's current hand and the computer's current hand. So I'm going to make a paragraph for each, the player's current hand and also the computer's current hand. And to make this clear, I'm going to add in a header here that says current round. Okay. Now in my browser, we can see current round, player, computer. Initially, by default, we can have the rock, a fist, be the first default round. But then when the user clicks on a button and when the computer makes a play, I want to update this HTML accordingly. So how can I do that? Well, I could do it with the help of JavaScript. Let's start in JavaScript here. In start round, this is the function that creates a new round whenever a button is clicked. So I can remove this console.log and instead I can update my HTML via JavaScript. So let's say whenever the user clicks a button, I want to take that emoji and put it as the player's current round emoji. In order to do that, I am going to take the text content and assign it to the text content inside of this paragraph. So first I need a reference to the player paragraph. In order to get a reference to the player paragraph, I'm going to give this paragraph a unique ID. The ID is going to be the player hand. Then I can use player hand. Oh, I already have player hand. Never mind. I'm going to use something else. I'm going to use player choice. Okay, player choice is going to be the paragraph here. Then, inside of my start round function, I'm going to first need to grab a reference to that player choice. So I need to make another variable called my player, and I'm going to use document.getElementById. GetElementById is a function that's going to get an element in my HTML, my document object model, via some ID. And in this case, the ID has to go in quotations because it's a string, and the ID is player choice. Here, we're taking letPlayer and we're assigning it the value of player choice. This way, we can always refer to the player's choice as this variable player. Note that the variable has to be on the left and the value you're assigning to the variable has to be on the right. All right, so now we have a reference to our player. We can verify that we have it by calling console.log player every time the button is pressed. So I can pop up my console, and now every time the button is pressed, okay, we get this HTML paragraph element. That's exactly what I expected to get. Okay, so we have verified that we can indeed reference the player. Now that we have a reference to the player, we can change this element. We got that element, and let's change it. So to change the element, we're going to call player.textContent. This means we're changing the text content of the paragraph. And you can use this for paragraphs or for divs and more. Then I can change this text content to something new. For example, I could change it to round has been played. So now every time a button is pressed, the player's text content should change to this string, because it's in quotation marks, round has been played. If we go to the browser, look at that. Suddenly my player became instead round has been played. What I want to do next is change it to say player and then whatever emoji the user clicked on. So for that, I'm going to change the player's text content to something else. The player's text content instead will be this.textContent. You may be wondering, what is this? This, whenever you use the keyword this, you're referring to the current instance. So in my case, the current instance is start round. And we have to do some backwards logic here, because start round, you'll notice here, start round is a callback function. It's a function that happened after a button had been clicked on. So start round is the event, and this is actually referring to the button that was clicked on. So if you go backwards, you can work this out. This refers to start round, which itself was called when a button was clicked. So the instance is actually the button that was clicked. This means we're taking the button that was clicked and we're grabbing its text content and we're assigning it to the player text content. Now in my browser, if I click on a button, look at that. Every time I click on a button, the emoji gets updated in my HTML. And just like that, we were able to update our HTML thanks to JavaScript. Now, let's say we want to also add the text that says player, just like we had initially. Well, to do that, we just have to add in, first off, backticks around this .text content. And then I'm going to take player, colon, because that's what I want to write, followed by a $sign and curly brackets encompassing this .text content. Let's break this down. What we're doing is we're making a string literal. So we are using back quotations, which can be found right beside the 1 on your keyboard. Player is still going to be treated as a piece of text, but because we're putting this .text content into curly brackets and preceded by a $sign, that means this .text content is actually going to be treated as a variable that we then inject into the string. Now, if I click on one of the buttons, look at this. Now my HTML gets updated to player followed by the emoji. Be very careful that you exactly follow this code. If I ignore this $sign, well, look at this. Suddenly, all I have is a bunch of text instead of becoming code. So make sure you have the $sign and the curly brackets. Otherwise, you'll notice you will not see this .text content being treated as a variable. Awesome. So just like that, we were able to take the player's action, the click of a button, and we were able to update the HTML with JavaScript. And that is exactly what JavaScript is for. Great, now that we know how to update the HTML with JavaScript, join me in the next lecture where we're going to now make the computer perform an action. Hello everyone and welcome back to Hello Coding. In the previous lecture, you learned how to update the HTML with the help of JavaScript. And now that you have this power, you're going to be able to do a lot more with your websites. Your websites are going to be able to be a lot more dynamic because now you know how you can update content on the website with the help of JavaScript. Next up, we are going to learn how we can enable the computer to perform around, because currently our player is playing, but the computer is always playing rock. Let's go ahead and change that. Inside of our JavaScript, we are going to make another variable with the help of the let keyword, and this is going to be called my computer choice. Initially, I can set this to equal 0. Here we have computer choice, and this is going to represent what the computer chooses to play, rock, paper, or scissors. We can represent each of these hands as a number, 0 for rock, 1 for paper, and 2 for scissors. So we can generate a random number, 0, 1, or 2, and whatever random number has been generated, that corresponds to the computer choice. How can we generate a random number? Well, luckily for us, there is a function known as math.random to get us started. Math is an object that has basic math functionality. That means it has functions for performing mathematical operations like, for example, squaring, square rooting, and also generating a random number, and much, much more. Math is a pre-made object, so it's intrinsic to JavaScript. We didn't have to make a math class ourselves in order to use math. Math is an object that is pre-made for us. And that saves us a lot of time because instead of having to write a function ourselves that generates a random number, JavaScript has already pre-written that function and put it into the math object. Math.random will generate a number between 0 and 1. And to test that out, I can show you we can call console.log and we can log out computer choice. Every time a new round is started, a new computer choice will be generated. We can see that in the browser. Every time I click, look at this, I generate a new random number starting with 0.44. And you'll notice every time the number is between 0 and 1. And every time I click on that value, or I click on the button, any button, I get a new random number. But how do we take that random number, which is a decimal, and how do we turn it into 0, 1, or 2? Well, what we can do is we can start off by multiplying the value by a value of 3. So I am going to go ahead and take that and take math.random, and I'm going to multiply it by 3. So now we are going to generate a slightly larger number. Here we can see instead of being between 0 and 1, it's going to be between 0 and 3. Great, so now we're able to generate a number between 0 and 3. So we'll have either 0, 1, or 2. But how do we truncate this so we don't have all those decimal places? Well, to do that, we can use another function known as math.floor. And we can wrap the math.random times 3 into math.floor. Whatever is inside of the parentheses deepest happens first, and then we go to whatever happens outside. That means first we'll do math.random times 3, and then we'll call math.floor. Floor is going to floor the decimal into an integer. It's going to remove all of the decimal places. So now if I test out my console, look at that. Now I am only getting values that are 0, 1, or 2 being logged out. Great, so that means we were successfully able to generate a value between 0 and 3, not including 3, so between 0, 1, and 2. Now that we have generated the computer's choice, what we can do is set the text content of the computer to match 0, 1, or 2, whatever it chose. So what we will do is we will first need a reference to the computer. So inside of our HTML, we have to give our computer paragraph an ID of computer choice. This way we can reference the computer choice paragraph. Inside of the JavaScript here, we're going to make another variable called the computer. And we will use document.getElementById. This time we're getting the element by ID computer choice. All right, then now that we have a reference to our computer, we can take the computer and change its text content. And we can change its text content to equal computer choice. So now in our browser, every time I click a button, my text changes not just in the player, but also in my computer paragraph here. But I don't just want 0, 1, or 2. I want to actually show the exact emoji that corresponds to 0, 1, or 2. 0 for rock, 1 for paper, and 2 for scissors. That's exactly what we'll work on in the next lecture. In the next lecture, we're going to learn how we can use an object in order to translate this 0, 1, and 2 efficiently into an emoji. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Hello Coding. In the previous lecture, you learned how we can use math.random and math.floor in order to generate a computer player. In this lecture, we're going to learn how to use objects in order to translate this number 0, 1, and 2 instead into an emoji that represents the computer hand. So for this, let's jump into our JavaScript. And we are going to make another variable here. This variable we will call hands. And we are going to make an array of hands. An array is like a list. We've already seen a node list earlier. Buttons was a node list. And a list means we're grouping objects together. How can we group objects together? Well, we put them into square brackets separated by a comma. So in our case, we are going to make this array, which is still a variable called hands, and we're going to put in our 3 emojis into this array. They are still strings, that's why they're in double quotation marks, meaning they're representing text. Even though they're emojis, they're still considered text. Another data type, like a number, like an integer, you would not put into double quotation marks. If you wanted to put in a decimal, again, you would not do double quotation marks. You could also do a Boolean value, which is true or false as well. It's another data type. And also there is the character, which is just a single letter or any single piece of string. So you could actually have the emoji be a character because it's just a single emoji instead of a series of emojis. All right, so here we have our first hand, which is the rock. Then let's put in the hand for paper. And finally, the hand for scissors. So we want to here be able to store all 3 of our possible hands. Why? Well, because that will allow us to very easily translate the computer choice into a hand. You'll recall that the computer choice, this is a number either 0, 1, or 2. Luckily for us, arrays actually follow that exact same pattern of counting. Arrays have what's known as zero-based indexing. So this means that in almost all programming languages, the counting of elements begins at 0. So there are 3 elements, yes, and the hands length array, the length of the array is 3, but the indexing actually begins at 0. So you can reference each item in the array by its index. I could grab the fist at index 0, the palm, which represents paper, as index 1, and the scissors at index 2. For example, let me show you. We can take computer.text content, and instead of setting it to computer choice, what we can do is we can set it to hands at index 0. Notice here I'm referring to the hands variable, and then after that I have square brackets, and inside I have a value. This has to be an integer, meaning a whole number, because index counting is always a whole number, 0, 1, 2. This means I want to get the item in the hands array that is at index 0. What do you think is going to appear in the computer's text content? Well, if we go to the browser, now every time I click a button, I'm always going to see the fist here. That's because the fist has index 0. What if we wanted to get the scissors? How could I get the scissors from the hands array? Well, I would do hands at index 2. That's right, we're doing at index 2, not at index 3, because actually in hands, there is no index 3. Index counting begins at 0. This may be a bit confusing at first because there are 3 elements, so you may be tempted to count 1, 2, 3 for the indices, but no, for the indices, the count actually begins at 0. So the last index will always be the number of elements minus 1. Now if we go into our browser, and whenever I click on a button, the computer's choice is always hands at index 2, which is scissors. Awesome. Okay, so instead of using hands at 2, I want to do what? I want to do hands at computer choice. You'll recall computer choice generates a random number 0, 1, or 2. That means I'm always going to get a random element from hands. We can test that out. And look at that. Every time I click on the button, I get a random value which corresponds to a random emoji inside of the hands array. Awesome. Other than that, I can also show that this is the computer's choice. So I can use a back quote at the beginning and at the end of hands computer choice to turn this into a string literal. Then I can say computer, and I can use the $sign followed by a curly bracket, and make sure you also use a closing curly bracket when you have finished enclosing the reference of the variable. So computer will be treated as a piece of text, but hands at computer choice, that will be treated as a variable instead of just some random text. Now in my browser, whenever I click on one of the buttons, now I see computer followed by the emoji that the computer randomly generated. Awesome, look at this. Now we have 2 players. We have the player generating some hand scissors and the computer generating some hand rock. And this changes every time I click the button. We now have our 2 players in our computer game here. Note that this game is local, meaning that we're just playing ourselves versus the computer on our website. We don't even need internet. If we save this whole file and then we opened up the HTML file in our browser, we could play this without internet. But if we wanted to play with other players around the world who connected via a website, then we would have to use a server to be able to send messages back and forth between different computers. Because currently I can only play this game on my computer only, and I can't connect any other computers. We'll learn a lot more about servers later on in Hello Coding. All right, now that we have our players, what is going to be our next step? Well, next step, we need to determine who won each round, and then we'll have to keep track of the player's score. We'll work on that in the next lecture. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Hello Coding. In the previous lecture, you learned how to update the computer's choice to show the emoji that the computer randomly generated. In this lecture, we're going to learn how we can determine the winner. So we'll have to write the logic to determine the winner of each round, and later on we can then update the score. All right, for that, let's hop into our JavaScript. And inside of start round, which runs each round, we're going to have to check who is the winner of the round. For that, let's open up an if statement to check one condition. An if statement uses the keyword if, and it allows you to run some code only if a certain condition is passed. The condition you specify in parentheses. First, let's check if this .text content is equal to a fist, so a rock. This means we're checking if the button that was pressed by the player was a rock. Notice here we're using 3 equal signs to check equality. With JavaScript, you want to use 3 equal signs when you're checking if a value is equal to another value. This is different from using 1 equal sign, which assigns a value to a variable. 3 equal signs, instead of assigning a value to a variable, it's actually instead checking equality between 2 items. Are the 2 items equal in value? If the player selected rock, we have to check to see if the computer selected paper, then the computer won. But if the computer selected scissors, then the player won. So what we're going to do is add a nested if statement, meaning an if statement inside of our already existing if statement. This second if statement will only run if the first if statement passed as true. If the first if condition here passed as false, then the code inside of the brackets gets completely skipped. It gets ignored by the compiler. Our next check here is going to be if the computer.text content is equal to a scissors or a paper. Let's do paper first. Okay, and note that we want to check if the computer text content is equal to actually this whole string. So it would be easier to check if computer choice is equal to 1 as an integer. So there are two different ways we could go about this. We could either check if the computer's text content is equal to computer at a fist, or we could just check if the computer choice was equal to 1, which corresponds to a little hand here, which means paper. Notice here I've used 2 forward slashes to create a single line comment in JavaScript. You can use single line comments to hide content from the compiler, but leave little comments for yourself, the developer. Okay, so if the computer chose 1, but the player chose a fist, then this means the computer won. So we can call console.log computer 1. Later on, we can replace this with updating the score instead. What if the computer did not choose 1 paper? What if the computer chose scissors instead? Well, in that case, we can use what's known as an else if statement to check that condition. An else if statement is similar to an if statement, but it's only going to run if the preceding if statement that's directly attached to it did not pass as true. So only if the first if statement's condition passed as false are we going to enter the else if statement. Else if the computer choice is equal to 2. This means the computer chose the scissors instead of paper or rock. And if the computer chose scissors, well, in that case, we need to call console.log that the player won, because the player won that round because rock beats scissors. Now, what if the computer chose rock? Well, in that case, nobody wins, so nobody's score will increase, so we actually don't have to do anything. We could, of course, call console.log nobody won, or we could just not do anything and move on to the next round. Next up, we need to then check what if the player did not select a rock? What if the player instead selected paper? Well, let's add an else if statement chained to our initial if statement. Notice here, this else if statement will only run if its attached if statement passed as false. So only if this attached if statement before it passed as false will the code inside the else if statement run. So else if this dot text content is equal to paper. In this case, the player selected paper. So we are going to check if the computer choice was equal to 0. We are now checking if the computer selected the rock. If the computer selected rock, then we're going to call console.log of what? Well, we're going to call console.log that the player won, because paper beats rock. Otherwise, if the computer choice was equal to 2. If the computer choice was equal to 2, that means the computer chose scissors. And in that case, if the computer chose scissors, that means the computer won. So we'll call console.log computer1. And what if the computer chose paper? Well, in that case, it means both players chose paper, so we can just skip ahead to the next round. Our final condition is what? Well, we've tested if the player chose rock, we've tested if the player chose paper, and now we have to check if the player chose instead the final option, which was scissors. We could do another else if statement and check for scissors, or we could actually do what's just known as an else statement. An else statement will run if all of its previous directly attached if statements passed as false. So if the first if statement passed as false and the second if statement passed as false, only then are we going to go to the else statement as our backup, our last resort. And in that case, what we'll do is, if the player chose scissors, we're going to perform a check to see if the computer choice is equal to 0 first of all. If the computer chose 0, that means they chose rock. And rock beats scissors, so we'll call console.log and we'll say computer1. Otherwise, we have to check if the computer choice was equal to 1. If the computer choice was equal to 1, that means the computer chose paper, and scissors beats paper, so we'll call console.log and we'll say that the player won. All right, and just like that, we have been able to write the logic that determines the winner for each round. Let's test out the logic we just wrote. Open up your browser and also the console. Then click on one of the buttons. And look at this. With our first round, the player chose scissors, but the computer chose paper. So we have console.logged that the player won. Then if we try again, this time the player chose rock, but the computer chose paper. So we have logged computer won. Then if I select paper, and the computer selected paper that time, and this time nothing was logged to the console because nobody won. I can try again. This time I've selected scissors and the computer has selected paper, and we have logged the player won. I can try again. This time the player selected paper and the computer selected scissors, so we have logged computer won. Awesome. So this has verified that we have been successfully able to write the logic that determines the winner of a rock, paper, scissors game. Next up, now that we've been able to determine our winner for each round, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a score to my website. This score is going to keep track of who is currently winning. Join me in the next lecture where we will implement a score. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Hello Coding. In the previous lecture, we learned how to write the logic to determine who wins a round. In this lecture, we are going to use that logic to also display the current score of the player and the current score of the computer. For this, we'll begin in our HTML file because our body tag, this requires us to put in either divs or paragraphs that show the current score, who is winning. So let's go ahead and put in another heading 2 that says score, and then we'll put in a div, one that has the ID of player score, and this will start off with player having a score of 0, and then we'll have another div with the ID of computer score, and this is going to keep track of how many points the computer has, also beginning at 0. Currently in our browser, we can see we have the heading score, and we begin at 0. Now, every time a round is played, if there's a winner, we want to update the scores accordingly. So for that, we're going to need to implement JavaScript. In our JavaScript here, instead of having console.log computer1 or player1, instead, we're going to want to increase the score. So let's make a variable called our player score, which will initially be 0, and a variable computer score, which will also initially be 0. But then each time that one of the players wins, we want to update the score accordingly. So if the computer won, then we want to take the computer score and we want to increase it by a value of 1. To increase the computer score, one way is to use the plus equals operator and assign a value of 1. This means we're taking the current computer score, we're adding 1, and we are reassigning computer score to the new value. Another way is to take the existing player score and just add 1. That's the equivalent. We can just take player score and add 1 to get the new player score that we'll then assign. A third way that we can increase a player score is just by using plus plus. Plus plus is a shorthand that will increase a value by 1. And we can do this because the type of player score is an integer. In JavaScript, you don't specify the type of a variable yourself. In other languages like Java and C# you do. You specify the type of the variable yourself. So you'd have to say player score is an int, an integer. But in JavaScript, you do not. You just use the keyword let or var to declare a variable. You don't have to declare the type. The type is inferred in JavaScript, meaning JavaScript will determine the type of a variable based on the value that you give that variable. Let's continue on here. Let's increase the value of computer score with computer score plus plus. Remember, plus plus is the equivalent of plus equals 1 and the equivalent of taking the score, increasing it by 1, and then assigning that new value to the original player score. Then following on, when the computer won, we'll do computer score plus plus, and when the player won, we'll do the player score plus plus. Great, so now we are storing and updating the computer and player score. But how do we actually render that change in the browser? How do we take this JavaScript variable, computer score or player score, and how do we put that onto the HTML? Well, to do that, all we have to do is grab a reference to these divs and update them. We've done that before. We've grabbed a reference to items and then updated them. So let's grab a reference to this player score and computer score divs. In JavaScript, make sure it's outside of the function start round. And we are going to make another variable that we'll call our player score div. And we are going to use document.getElementById. Make sure you spell it exactly properly, getElementById, with the exact capitalization. And we're going to get the element that has the ID of player score. Then we're going to take that element, which is a div, and we'll store it in this variable called player score div. Note that even though the ID is the same as the variable we declared, those are actually two different things. Let player score, that's a variable, but here player score is a string referring to an ID. All right, next up, let's get the computer score div with document.getElementById of computer score. So now we are getting the computer score div, and we're storing it in a variable. Then we can update the value of the score at the end of each round. So at the end of the start round function, we can take our player score div and we can update its text content. We can use backticks and say that the player should show the player score here. Let's test that out. Now in our browser, every time the player wins, look at that. The player's score gets updated every time they win. We can do a very similar process for the computer. We'll take computer score div dot text content and we are going to assign it to backticks of computer followed by the variable value that is being stored in computer score. Now if we go to our browser and we click on one of the buttons, that will trigger a round, and each time whenever a player wins, their score gets updated if they won. Awesome. Okay, and that is how we can build a game from scratch in JavaScript. Congratulations, everyone. You now know how to use JavaScript, which is one of the most popular programming languages used today. Join me in our next course in another day of Hello Coding.